Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over Part 3, Chapter 1 of George Orwell's 1984. Julia and Winston have both been caught by the thought police and are surrounded. Let's see what happens to Winston, shall we? Chapter 1 starts off with Winston in one of the white-celled rooms and what he believes to be the Ministry of Love. He tells the reader how it is a windowless cell with walls of glittering white porcelain, concealed flood lamps that produce cold light, and a low, steady humming sound, which he supposed was the air supply. He said a bench or a shelf that was just high enough to sit on that ran across the hall, broken by the door. And at the other end of the door was a lavatory pan with no wooden seat. He also says there were 4 telescreens, one on each of the walls, that were constantly on and operating. As he's sitting there, the only thing he can really concentrate on is his stomach and how hungry he is. The only thing he wants is a piece of bread. He says he goes and sits on the bench and makes sure to sit very still, hands crossed on his knees. He says he's not sure the last time he's eaten, and at one point the hunger controls him so much that he reaches into his pockets, hoping to find some small pieces of breadcrumbs that he can put in his mouth. As he reaches into his pocket, a voice from the telescreen yells 6079, Smith W, hands out of your pockets now. As the voice says this, he does take his hands out of his pockets and put them back on his knees. Winston goes on to say that before he entered this room, he remembered being in another prison that could have been 2 or 3 or 4 days earlier. He says that when they initially took him in, they put him into a holding cell that was like a county jail. Inside this cell, there were a bunch of proles and other people all locked up together. One particular person that comes to mind is an older woman of about 60 who's carried in by 4 guards, one holding on to an arm and a leg. As they throw her into the cell, she yells, "You fucking bastards," as they throw her across Winston's thighs. She apologizes for the fact that she landed on him, but that's where the guards threw her. When she gets up and turns around, she throws up into a corner and then goes back to sit by Winston. She asks his name, and she says that she is also a Smith. Winston said that possibly this could be his mother, because he hadn't seen her in such a long time, and if she were in a labor camp first, it would be about the right age that she would be now. After this memory, he goes back to the present where he's sitting inside of his white jail cell. From the outside, he can hear boots marching down the hallway, and his door suddenly opens. The guards throw in this large person of a man who looks like he hasn't shaven in days, and Winston realizes this person is Ampleforth, the poet from the Ministry of Truth. Winston is very surprised to see Ampleforth inside of jail, and when he asks what brought him in here, Ampleforth responds that he was translating one of Rudyard Kipling's poem and could not find a word that rhymed with rod. So he used the original rhyme and kept the word God in. Ampleforth seemed very proud of the fact that he did this. During their conversation, Ampleforth asks, "Has it never occurred to you that the whole history of the English poetry has been determined by the fact that English language lacks rhyme?" Winston really didn't see how this mattered, and Winston asks, "Do you know what time it is?" Ampleforth says they arrested him, and it could have been 2 days or even 3. He wasn't quite sure. He said there's no difference between night and day in this place, and he doesn't see how someone can calculate the time. Not long after this, a voice from the telescreen tells them to shut up, and they do. Winston goes back to sitting very still, and Ampleforth, being so large, is unable to fully sit and instead paces across the room. It is not long after this that the voice again yells at Ampleforth to stay still. About 5 minutes later, the door opens and one of the guards comes in, looks at Ampleforth, and says, "Room 101. They escort him away, and Winston is left in the jail cell alone. He's left with his thoughts, and the only real thoughts he can think about are the pain in his stomach, how he's hungry, the screaming he can hear, O'Brien, Julia, and the razor blade. After a while, the door opens again, and from a distinct smell, Parsons walks into the jail cell. Winston is incredibly surprised that Parsons, of all people, is inside of this jail, especially because he was such a devoted member of the party that he couldn't see Parsons doing anything wrong to get him there in the first place. Winston asks, "How did you get in here, and are you guilty?" Parsons responds that he is guilty and that it was his daughter who had turned him in. Apparently, when he was sleeping, his daughter was at the keyhole at the door listening and overheard Parsons saying "down with Big Brother" in his sleep, to which she immediately ran to the thought police and turned him in. Even through this, Parsons still praises his daughter from being a good devoted girl to the party. Parsons even says that hopefully they'll let him go for good behavior or send him to a labor camp for a few years. He said that when he goes to see the members of the party, he's going to thank them for bringing him in, and hopefully this will reduce his sentence. With all this talking, Parsons says that he's got to use the restroom and looks over at Winston and apologizes. He goes over to the metal pan, pulls his pants down, and begins to defecate into the pan. However, the plug was defective, which left the cell stinking abominably for hours afterwards. As Parsons is using the restroom, Smith covers his face to avoid the smell, but a yell from the telescreen tells him to uncover his face. Not long after, Parsons is taken away and Winston is left alone again. Winston notes that from time to time, more people are brought into the room. He said at one point there was about 6 people inside of the same cell that he was in. One man, who was chinless, very sallow, was sitting across from him. Another was brought in a little while later, who looked like he had been starved for about 2 weeks. Winston identifies him as the Skull Man, due to the fact that you could tell, due to starvation, that his skin was becoming thinner and thinner. The man who was chinless kept looking over at the Skull Man and darting his eyes away when the Skull Man would meet his gaze. Then, all of a sudden, the chinless man stands up, goes over to the Skull Man, reaches into his pockets and grabs a piece of bread and offers it to him. At that instant, a voice from the telescreen shouts, "2713, Bromstead J, let fall that piece of bread." He does, and the voice says, "Remain standing where you are, face the door, and make no movements." The chinless man obeys, and right after this, the door opens and 2 guards come in and begin to beat him up. At one point, one of the guards hits him so hard in his chin that it actually causes the man to fly across the room into the lavatory, and blood comes pouring out of his face. When he's able to get on his hands and knees, the denture plate that was inside of his mouth had split in half and fell out. He then gets back up and goes and sits down. Not long after this, the guards come into the cell and begin to look at the Skull Man. They tell him room 101, and he immediately gets on the floor on his hands and knees and begs to have a different option. Then all of a sudden he looks over towards the chinless man and says, "That's the man who you want. He is an enemy of the party. He is against the party, not me." He says, "You didn't hear him. Something went wrong with the telescreens. He's the one you want. Take him, not me." The Skull Man grabs onto one of the iron legs of the bench, and the guard struggles to get him off. It's not until they crush his hands with his boot that the skull-faced man lets go and they drag him away. Winston says the hours go by and slowly each of the prisoners leave except for him. He is left all alone. He mentions to the reader that the piece of bread that had been dropped earlier was still there, and at first it was hard to look away, but now the thought of thirst is what pervaded his mind. Winston walks around the cell and thinks of a lot of different things. The first being that hopefully O'Brien is able to have someone sneak a razor blade in so that way he can end his life before the party has any time to hurt him. He also thought of Julia and how much pain she probably is in, and he thought that if there was any way to take her pain away, he would do it. Winston tells the reader that after a little while the doors open and O'Brien steps in. The first thing that Winston says is, "They've got you too." O'Brien said, "Oh, they got me a long time ago." From behind him, a broad-chested guard with a long black truncheon steps into view. O'Brien says, "You knew this. Don't deceive yourself. You've always known it." Winston says there is no time to think, and all of a sudden the guard swings the truncheon and it hits him in his left arm. Winston says the amount of pain that comes from this is unbearable, and he's immediately crumpled onto the floor. He says that never for any reason on earth could you wish for an increase of pain. You could only wish for one thing, and that it should stop. He said nothing in the world was as bad as physical pain, and in the face of pain, there are no heroes. And he thought this over and over again as he writhed on the floor, clutching uselessly at his disabled left arm. This is where Chapter 1, Part 3 ends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please tune in next time as we go over Chapter 2. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, stay lit.